The EPA tests have long been regarded by many to be the most accurately representative of reality, especially compared with older standards such as JC08 and NEDC. But recent sets of results, particularly those for new vehicles with newer technologies, such as electric vehicles, throw its consistency and thus its credibility into question. There is one obvious factor that could easily be fixed to improve matters. I'll explain that next on the Tinker Talks. Standardize my butt. Agencies and organizations, such as the US EPA and others, conduct tests in an effort to, in a transparent fashion, provide a consistent, understandable reference for consumers to use for making the right decision for them when buying a vehicle. The problem is that sometimes this data is presented to the consumer and general public in a non-intuitive and even deceptively confusing way, to some degree allowing companies to play by sort of different rules. This leaves the public essentially misled. Oddly, this is usually to the disadvantage of companies who willingly put themselves in this disadvantaged position. There are a lot of potential problems with the way that things are calculated and presented to the public. I think that we should try to address them and improve upon them. We'll never get it perfect, but I am confident we can provide more relevant information more clearly than we currently do. If we keep improving things, I think with your help, we may be able to come up with a much improved Monroney sticker. After all, above anything else, in the USA, this sticker or its information is what is presented to the public. It is what everyone sees when they go to buy a car. Maybe someone over there will take notice and improve upon what everyone sees. The first major thing I think needs to be addressed is the range numbers presented on the Monroney sticker and by the EPA. I'm mentioning this first because many new vehicles are coming out with confusing range figures. These figures are not consistently rectifiable with reality, let alone with other testing schemes or regimes. For instance, with one car you could shave off 10% to get a realistic figure, but for another you might need to add over 20%. I'm sure you could see how that would be confusing. When people get confused, they might look to ratings elsewhere. However, the ratings from different sources are very inconsistent in their proportions to EPA. For example, WLTP isn't 10% less with perhaps 10% variance. It's nowhere near that consistent, at least right now. Inside EVs showed in a nice graph, linked below, where sometimes WLTP is 42% more than the EPA rating, and sometimes it's 10% less. Wow. Good luck figuring out statistical trends, let alone realistic figures, from that. I must mention, for those who aren't familiar, that numerous factors influence your efficiency and subsequently your range. This is true for any vehicle, not just electric vehicles or EVs. These include, but are not limited to, environmental factors such as temperature, precipitation, road surface, driving behavior, and overall speed, especially relative to the wind. So results will vary from person to person, place to place, and season to season. Your mileage may vary has never been so true. The EPA chose to represent this range number as one simple number for everyone, which essentially guarantees it will be a fair bit off for most people. I think they attempt to present the range for their combined testing cycle, the goal of which is to roughly represent the average US driver's experience. If the official ratings were more consistent, people could adjust for their own specifics. Another thing that could help would be to show range numbers for the city, highway, and combined, separate, instead of one unspecified number. I might go into more of that in another video. We'll see. That being said, here are a few examples that might illustrate inconsistencies with EPA, WLTP, and real-world tests. I included the independent tests by Bjorn Nyland, aka Tesla Bjorn. Those show clearly that reality can be quite different than any official test results show. Looking at these numbers, you'll see that sometimes the ratings for both EPA and WLTP end up with a reasonable tolerance of some real-world results. As shown here by the Tesla Model S long-range Raven version, the 56 miles per hour constant speed test by Bjorn is basically the same as the official EPA number, and the WLTP number isn't that far off either. But the Porsche Taycan results are quite different. Bjorn's test showed 360 miles at the same speed, whereas the EPA gave it only 203. This is one of those, what? Sort of figures. You can see other confusing differences in other vehicles. Here I chose the Polestar 2. In that case, the difference wasn't quite so big, but in some ways that's bad. Because now you have the situation where it's hard to characterize what you would get yourself. For a given person, vehicle, and situation, the EPA rating can be spot on, rather far off, or way far off. If the EPA doesn't disclose clearly that there are differences in the way those vehicles are tested, or what those differences are or might mean for the actual range they might get, then that is a serious problem. Now, the Porsche Taycan is a very expensive luxury sports car. Its potential buyers are not as likely to be concerned about range as much as the performance. Characteristics like acceleration, handling, and interior appointment are typically more important to people like that, at least when it comes to such a vehicle. But there may be evidence to support that the lower rating is leading to somewhat proportionally lower sales. In Europe, for instance, where they generally use the more generous figure for the Taycan sells at a greater percentage for the total sales of Porsche. There it was their best-selling model of the month of August at 23.7%. When you compare that to the United States, where its third quarter sales were just at 12% of the total sales for Porsche. Is this related to the lower EPA rating that we use here in the United States? Perhaps partially. I'll have a couple of links to articles showing those figures in the description. I think the vehicles designed for the mass market, intended to be used as a primary vehicle or only vehicle, are much more sensitive to low-range figures. Experts and experienced consumers/journalists are not so put off by such low figures when they're shopping for themselves. Many of them are confident that these figures are unrealistically low, and that they can handle any limitations that those cars present. However, Tom Malogny brought up valid concerns. I believe it was in Inside EV's podcasts 28, maybe 27. The dealers he works with to help bolster their training, thumbs up to both sides for that by the way, have concerns over these low figures. At Volvo dealerships he's worked with, they were worried that the Volvo XC40 Recharge would look so much worse because the range rating from the EPA is so much lower than competing vehicles. Vehicles such as the Model Y, with 326 miles of range, the Kia Niro EV at 239 miles, the Hyundai Kona EV at 258 miles, etc. They're concerned their offering would be overlooked in favor of one of those, or even an internal combustion engine, ICE, vehicle. Perhaps one they would buy elsewhere. What are they supposed to say? Go on to YouTube and watch Bjorn Nyland's test. He's much more trustworthy than the government. Yeah. I'm not sure of the exact legalities. I'm pretty sure they can't just paste over the EPA number on the sticker with one that they feel is more accurate. It's supposed to be a standard for comparison between different vehicles that do the same tests. Part of the problem is, they don't. And all of this leads to a critical point. If all of this silliness leads to people buying an ICE vehicle over an EV, we all lose. Range has been the most important factor for people considering an EV, even above price. This is shown in many surveys that I've seen, like this one from Pulse News. The link is in the description. So obviously the range number is massively influential on whether or not someone purchases an electric vehicle. It essentially boils down to consumer confidence. People ask, will it be practical for me? Will it do what I need it to as long as I want it to? The evaluation involves range, then format, if it fits what you need it to, then price and more emotional factors, like aesthetics. When it comes to price, many people prefer or would rather have a certain price rather than need a certain price. But a vehicle more rigidly needs to fit a certain amount of people or a certain amount of stuff. Despite all of this, one of the smallest numbers on the Monroney sticker is the one for range. And I don't think cargo capacity is even on there. Is even the amount of seats on there? Instead, the most prominent figure is the combined efficiency. In an almost meaningless unit, especially when it comes to knowledgeable consumers, they called miles per gallon equivalent, or MPG, with a small e. Why? That's probably a tangent for yet another video. Here's the situation. Basically, each OEM is offered an option. They can choose between a simpler, less extensive, and probably less expensive set of tests, or a more comprehensive set. One of the effects that you get when you choose the more comprehensive set is that you get a variance from the default, seemingly arbitrary, correction factor, which is used in the calculations to derive range. There are many other factors that end up being more influential in the final range figure, but if in fixing this we get 5, 10, or maybe even 15% closer to a reasonable, consistent result, I'll call that a big win. Remember, the sticker in the normal marketing isn't going to make it clear which tests they chose to do. And even if they did, the vast majority of people would have no idea what they're talking about. And ignore it, probably. Of those vehicles I showed you earlier that had major differences in the EPA, WLTP, and real-world range figures, can you guess which ones did the less extensive tests? That's right. Now, is that a coincidence? So why are companies choosing to acquire lower ratings, especially when that is inconsistent with what their competitors are doing? Are they trying to underpromise and overdeliver? If that is the tactic used with the EPA, why is the WLTP often, but not consistently, the opposite? It seems very difficult to achieve the WLTP ratings consistently with some cars, whereas with some cars it would be difficult not to beat the EPA rating under average usage. Is this really attributable to cultural differences? Deploying different philosophies in different continents? Or is it just irrational? And confusing from the public and potential consumers' perspectives? Perhaps ultimately it's consistency that is most important, as people will get used to adjusting for what their experiences and circumstances tell them what their real-world results will be as a variance from the standardized test results. If that doesn't vary wildly from case to case, people will feel more comfortable and ultimately more satisfied with their decisions. When things are not this way, people feel like they are being lied to or manipulated, even if that isn't the intention. And I doubt that's what most of them are trying to do. But this semi-secret duality of standards causes problems. It's kind of like a game of football or soccer, where the referees come out and say to each team, "Which set of rules do you want to play by? If you run around the field twice and do 20 jumping jacks, you can use your hands. But if you choose not to, you can only use your feet, maybe even including the goalie." The catch is that each team is able to independently decide for just their team. And it even isn't explained well, if at all, to the public what's going on. They just start playing. If the two teams played by different rules, you'd expect the end score to be a little bit different than normal, wouldn't you? How do you think the fans and spectators would react? With confusion? Doubt as to what they're seeing? Anger? Having multiple teams playing the same game but by different rules, even if they choose to do so themselves, seems pretty weird, doesn't it? Is that sort of what we're seeing here? Or is this, since these are supposed to be standardized tests, more like the SATs, the standardized aptitude tests? But instead of everyone getting the same standardized test, the students that choose to do a longer test can get a sort of extra credit, thus invalidating the standardization. Maybe that's closer in some ways. As I mentioned, this is far from the only thing that leads to weirdly non-realistic ratings. But this duality can be fixed with a simple policy change that can be essentially immediately and instantaneously implemented. That would be my recommendation. In the interests of consistency and clarity for the public, make everyone play by the same rules, and make everyone take the same tests. Have only one set. If the OEMs complain, tell them, too bad. This is messing up the consumer, especially with these new vehicle types they are not so familiar with. Not to mention, it seems to be very much in their own best interests. Surely having much lower ratings than your competitors is bad for business. And in order to counteract that, as it is today, it probably costs more in marketing, dealer training, and damage control, with things like other independent tests, link in the description for the Taycan example, to make up for this range number disadvantage than it would have cost to just do the more extensive tests in the first place. I bet these results are negatively impacting their bottom line, as it makes their products look not as competitive as perhaps they should. Why did they do this to themselves? Well, it wouldn't have made up the whole difference in the buying public's eye, but they would have looked more competitive. Again, this is probably negatively impacting the public's perception of electric vehicles in general, making it seem like, to those who don't look too deep, that EVs are impossibly expensive and incapable, which just isn't true. This is bad for everyone. What can the public do in the meantime to find out the real deal? Sadly, if they want to know, they're going to have to do more work themselves. Thankfully, there are a number of good sources for real-world test results. No tests are perfect, but you can get a much better feel for what a vehicle can do by referencing these sources. How would the public find out that they should look up more info? Social media? Salesmen at the dealerships? I don't know. I'll do my part by telling you about them now, and put a bunch of links to them in the description. First, Bjorn Nyland, funny Norwegian guy. A little goofy and he knows it. He does really good tests, and shares a lot of data on Google Docs and Sheets. His range test specific playlist will be linked in the description. Check him out if you really want to know how EVs perform in the real world. But not just on maximum range, but also on road trips. He does a 1,000 kilometer challenge that I think is quite enlightening. Next we have Inside EVs. This is a news site with a lot of contributors, with varying opinions. I like it. The main two people I would like to mention from here are Tom Malogny and Kyle Connor. Both of these guys do 70-mile-per-hour range tests on vehicles they get their hands on. They do that test specifically because they think it is most relevant for most people, as it shows approximately what the lowest range you might get for a specific vehicle during a specific season might be. I'll link the range test category of their website, as that also includes some independent tests as well. The website ev-database.org has some figures that some people hold in rather high regard. It is very European-focused, but still probably better than using the EPA or WLTP numbers for most people in most places anyway. You could take a look at it and tell me if you think that's the case. I don't know if anyone compiles and maybe makes averages of these results. Maybe that's what part of what EV database does. I don't know. If you want to check any range ratings yourself from the official source, the website is fueleconomy.gov. I feel it's pretty silly that we have to go to fueleconomy.gov to find the ratings for vehicles that use no fuel. We should really change it. How about EPAvehicleratings.gov? Or maybe even combining multiple things that different parts of the government do into one place, and call it something like vehicletests.gov. If you have any other ideas, please leave it in the comments. I mentioned that there were many factors to this test, but I'm not currently competently capable of explaining those. And they are out of the scope of this video. But if you want to learn more, please check out the video linked below by Engineering Explained. He did his best to try and explain those, and I think he did a pretty good job. His video is based on an article from Car and Driver. It might be worth checking out that too. So what do you think? Do you like this nonsensical number puke? Or is it not that bad? Perhaps you would prefer for us to have these standardized tests be able to ever increasingly reflect reality. If you have suggestions about how to achieve this, leaving them in the comments wouldn't hurt. I don't know everything, and I can definitely be wrong, but I'm pretty confident I'm on the right track with this one. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.